Jake had always believed he lived the kind of life others would envy. He had a job that paid well, a house that felt like a dream come true, and a wife who could light up any room with her smile. His friends often called him lucky. You've got it all, they'd say. And for years, Jake had agreed. He had the house, the career, and Sarah. What else could he need? Their home was nestled on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by the tranquil hum of nature, the kind of place people fantasize about. The backyard stretched into an oasis, complete with a shimmering pool that reflected the blue skies above. It was his pride and joy, a feature that had drawn Sarah's attention from the very beginning. Every weekend they'd sit by the poolside, sipping wine, talking about their dreams, laughing about trivial things. Those were the moments Jake clung to when life fell uncertain, the moments that defined his idea of happiness. Sarah, his wife of 5 years, was everything Jake had hoped for in a partner. Beautiful, kind-hearted, and endlessly supportive. They met in college, and from the first date, there was a spark. Their love seemed effortless, like it was meant to be. Their relationship had always felt natural, easy, no drama, no complications. Even their circle of friends admired how well they fit together, like two pieces of a puzzle that were never meant to be apart. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it all. They had even talked about their future, kids, vacations, getting older together. Sarah had always been the one to bring it up, teasing him about their perfect family and what it would look like. Jake never doubted it. She was his rock, and he believed he was hers. But lately, something fell off. Jake couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had begun to shift. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It was the small things. The way Sarah had started staying late at work, the distant look in her eyes when they sat down to dinner. At first, he shrugged it off. She was busy with her new promotion at the advertising agency, after all. But then, it became more than just a few late nights. There was an unease in the air, something Jake couldn't ignore, but he chose to. He convinced himself that everything was fine. They were just going through a phase. That's all. The reality was too painful to face. Sarah was still the woman he loved, and their life together was still the one he dreamed of, or so he thought. And so, life continued, with the illusion of perfection hanging in the air until the moment everything changed. For a while, Jake tried to convince himself that he was overthinking things. Maybe Sarah was just stressed. Work was demanding, and the house was a lot to keep up with. He had even joked about it one evening, teasing her about being married to her career now. Sarah had smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The smile felt forced, almost as if she was trying to mask something, and Jake had brushed it off, pretending not to notice. He didn't want to confront what his gut was telling him, that something had shifted in the air between them, but the signs kept piling up. It wasn't just the late nights anymore. It was the subtle changes. The way Sarah had started to pull away from their conversations, the quietness that had crept into their once lively dinners. She no longer seemed interested in the plans they used to make together, the future they had always talked about. It wasn't a matter of her not participating. It was more the absence of her enthusiasm. She had become distant, like she was somewhere else, physically present, but emotionally absent. Jake noticed it in little moments. When he would reach for her hand, and she would withdraw it just a second too late. When he'd ask her about her day, she would answer with one-word responses, as if she was being polite, but didn't really care to engage. And then there were the phone calls, the ones that she never used to hide from him, but now answered quickly, stepping into the other room, her voice muffled, a look of anxiety on her face. The worst part was the pool. It had always been their sanctuary, a place where they could relax, unwind, and enjoy each other's company. But recently, Sarah had taken to spending more time there alone. Even on nights when it was chilly, when the house was quiet and the pool lights cast an eerie glow on the water, Sarah would slip out, wrapped in a robe, and disappear into the night. Jake had once joined her on one of these late-night swims, but she'd insisted he go to bed, claiming she needed the space to clear her head. He was used to Sarah enjoying solitude, but this was different. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, a kind of secretiveness that made Jake's chest tighten. He found himself lying awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the soft splash of water from the pool, knowing she was out there, but not knowing why. One evening, Jake decided to follow her. He hadn't meant to, but the quiet unease in his chest had pushed him over the edge. His feet were almost silent against the cold tiles of the kitchen as he watched Sarah through the window, slipping into her robe and making her way toward the pool. The moon was barely visible through the clouds, casting shadows over the water. She didn't look back as she moved, her footsteps steady and deliberate. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he watched her. He stayed low, hidden behind the half-drawn curtains, not daring to move an inch. His mind raced with questions. Why was she out there again? What was going on? Then, as if on cue, a figure appeared from the shadows at the far end of the pool. It was a man, tall, with broad shoulders, and wearing a dark jacket. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They spoke for a moment, their voices too low for him to hear, but he could see Sarah's posture, too relaxed, too familiar. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She didn't seem worried. In fact, she smiled, a smile that was more intimate than any Jake had ever seen her give him, a smile that made his stomach twist in knots. Jake watched them for a long time, his body frozen in place, unable to tear his eyes away. It wasn't until the man leaned in and kissed Sarah that the truth finally slammed into him, heavy and painful. She was seeing someone else. A wave of shock swept over him, followed by a rush of anger. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His heart had betrayed him, racing in his chest as he stumbled back from the window. The room spun, and for a long moment, he just stood there, hands trembling at his sides. He had been right all along. But the truth was more unbearable than he could have ever imagined. And in the stillness of the night, Jake realized that everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, was a lie. Jake couldn't sleep that night. His body was heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed, and his mind churned with questions. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing faster than he could keep up. How long had this been going on? How could she do this to me? The questions spiraled, gnawing at him like a hunger he couldn't quiet. His entire world felt like it had been turned upside down, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The man at the pool, Luke, he had called him in his mind, was an enigma. Who was he? Where had he come from? Jake needed answers, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of urgency, like something had to be done before he lost control of it all. But how could he confront Sarah? How could he even ask her about it without sounding insane or desperate? He spent the next few days in a haze, avoiding Sarah whenever possible, pretending nothing had changed. He could barely look her in the eye when they spoke, and every touch felt like a lie. She seemed oblivious to the tension between them, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling in Jake's mind. But it wasn't just the guilt eating at him. It was the need for certainty. He needed to know everything. No more guessing. No more half-truths. He had to know who Luke was, how long this affair had been going on, and why Sarah hadn't been honest with him. The thought of it all made his stomach twist. But the only way to find out was to take matters into his own hands. The opportunity came 2 days later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, when Sarah mentioned she was meeting a friend for coffee. She had already gotten dressed and was about to leave when Jake casually asked, "What friend?" "Oh, just Emma," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse. "You've met her a few times." Jake nodded, hiding the wave of suspicion that hit him. Emma? He didn't know any Emma, but that was beside the point. He couldn't shake the thought that there was more to her answer than she was letting on. Just Emma was a vague excuse, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was another one of her half-truths. As soon as she left, Jake felt a rush of adrenaline. He couldn't let this go. It was time to find out who Luke was and what his connection to Sarah was. He grabbed his keys, slipped on his jacket, and headed out the door, determined to follow Sarah's every move. His eyes scanned the neighborhood as he drove, trying to push down the nausea rising in his throat. His mind replayed the image of Sarah and Luke by the pool, the way they had kissed, the intimacy of their conversation. How could I not see this coming? He followed Sarah's car to a small cafe in the city. She parked and entered without noticing him, her posture too relaxed, too confident. Jake parked a few blocks away and walked back toward the cafe on foot, careful not to attract attention. His heart was racing now, a mixture of anticipation and dread. He couldn't help but feel like he was doing something wrong, but he also knew there was no turning back. This was the only way to understand what had been happening behind his back. From across the street, he watched Sarah sit at a corner table with no surprise. Luke. Jake's pulse quickened. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, just as he had appeared by the pool, but now Jake could see him more clearly. He had short, dark hair and a chiseled jawline, the kind of face that women would find striking. But it wasn't just Luke's looks that made Jake's stomach churn. It was the way Sarah was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting casually on his arm. Every laugh, every touch, made Jake's blood run cold. This wasn't some fleeting flirtation. This was real. Sarah was deep into this affair, and from the way they were interacting, it had been going on for longer than Jake had ever suspected. As they sat, sipping their coffee, Jake couldn't hear their conversation, but he could read their body language, the ease with which they spoke to each other. The shared intimacy in their gestures was a slap in the face. It was a stark contrast to the silence he and Sarah had been living in for the past few months. There was a closeness between them that Jake could never have imagined. For the first time, Jake realized just how far Sarah had pulled away from him. It wasn't just that she was seeing someone else. It was the fact that she had emotionally checked out long before she had physically strayed. The distance between them hadn't been a result of work or stress. It had been a deliberate choice, a silent withdrawal from the love they had once shared. A surge of anger flared inside Jake, but he fought it down. Confronting her now, here in public, would only make things worse. He needed to wait to think this through, but seeing them together, so comfortable, so unashamed, it hit him harder than he expected. After about an hour, Sarah and Luke stood up. Sarah hugged him goodbye, the kind of hug Jake had always given her, warm and lingering. As she walked away, Luke's eyes followed her, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made Jake's hands ball into fists. When Sarah was out of sight, Luke got into his car and drove off in the opposite direction. Jake stood frozen for a few moments, absorbing the truth. The pieces had fallen into place. Sarah wasn't just having an affair. She had been living two lives, and Jake had been the oblivious fool. But now he had all the information he needed. The man, the affair, the betrayal. And soon, Sarah would have to answer for it all. Jake couldn't wait any longer. The truth was now undeniable, and with each passing minute, the weight on his chest grew heavier. Every part of him screamed to confront Sarah, to demand the answers he'd been searching for, but he knew this moment had to be calculated. He couldn't give her the satisfaction of an impulsive confrontation. He needed her to face the full weight of her lies. The day had started like any other. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across their backyard. The pool glimmered in the fading daylight, its surface shimmering like glass. It had always been a place of peace, a place where they shared quiet moments, where they once floated in each other's arms. But now, the pool was a symbol of everything that had been shattered. Jake paced the living room, trying to steady his breathing. His phone sat on the coffee table in front of him, an unspoken reminder of Sarah's lies. He knew she would be home soon. The thought of seeing her again, pretending everything was normal, made his stomach twist. He didn't know how to look her in the eyes anymore. How could he? How could he look at her and not see the lies of deceit? When the door finally opened, Sarah stepped inside, smiling as usual, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She didn't even look up from her phone as she called out to him, "Hey, babe, I'm home." Jake stood by the window, staring out at the pool, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had to do this. He couldn't let her think she had control anymore, not after everything she had done. The thought of the man, Luke, made him seethe, but he kept his voice steady, his tone calm. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk." She looked up, a small frown on her face as she put her phone down. "What's wrong? You seem off." Jake's eyes narrowed, his gaze cutting through her pretenses. He had been trying to piece together the fragments of his trust, but now it felt like the final stitch was being pulled loose. "I know about him," he said softly, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Sarah froze, her face going pale. For a moment, there was a long silence. just the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of the house. Jake could see the panic rise in her eyes, her lips trembling as she tried to compose herself. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, but Jake could hear the cracks in her voice. The denial was obvious, and yet he felt no relief from hearing it. It only deepened his sense of betrayal. You don't know what I mean? Jake repeated, his voice growing harder, but still under control. He turned to face her, stepping away from the window and slowly walking toward the kitchen. He felt the tightness in his chest, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But he pushed it down. This moment was bigger than his rage. It was bigger than Sarah's lies. This was about closure, about understanding the full extent of her deception. You don't think I saw you with him? Jake's voice was steady now, every word cutting through the air with sharp precision. The man you've been seeing, Sarah. Luke, I saw you two together at that cafe. The way you looked at each other, the way you smiled at him. He paused, watching as Sarah's face fell, her eyes shifting to the floor. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a hesitant step toward him, as if she might reach out for his hand, but Jake stepped back. His chest felt tight again, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Jake, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't mean for it to get this far. The apology hit him like a slap, and it only made his anger grow. You didn't mean for it to get this far, he repeated incredulously. You didn't mean for me to find out. Is that it? What about the lies? What about the months of secrecy? You've been hiding this from me, Sarah, in my own damn house. Sarah's face twisted in pain, and Jake almost felt a flicker of sympathy for her, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He could see the guilt in her eyes, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. It wasn't enough to make up for the weeks of isolation, the countless moments when Jake had reached out and she had pushed him away. I'm sorry, she repeated, her voice breaking. I don't know what happened. Things just changed. I felt like you weren't really there anymore, Jake. I was trying to make it work, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to fix it. And then Luke came into my life, and I don't know. It just happened. Jake shook his head in disbelief. You let it happen. You chose it. There was a long silence, a heavy weight hanging in the air as Sarah struggled to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to hurt you, but I was so lonely, Jake. I felt like you didn't care anymore. You were always working, always distracted. I couldn't reach you. I thought, she paused, her eyes filling with tears. I thought maybe I could feel something again with him. Maybe I could find that spark. Jake's heart twisted at her words, but the anger still clung to him, stubborn and insistent. You found it with him, he said bitterly. You didn't come to me, Sarah. You didn't try to fix this. You chose him. She nodded, wiping away a tear, but it was no use. The damage had been done. The image of her with Luke, their quiet, intimate moments, was burned into Jake's mind. He couldn't unsee it. And he didn't know how to look at Sarah the same way ever again. The truth of her betrayal settled in his chest like a stone. It felt heavy, suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman standing in front of him wasn't the one he had married. She was a stranger now, someone who had lied, someone who had broken the bond they had built together. For a long time, there was silence between them, and the weight of the situation seemed to press down on the room. Then, without warning, Jake turned and walked toward the door. He couldn't stay here, not like this, not with the betrayal still fresh on his mind. Sarah called after him, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. He needed space to breathe, to think, to process everything that had happened. As he stepped outside into cool evening air, he walked toward the pool, its calm waters reflecting the darkening sky above. For a moment, he stood there, looking down at the surface, and then he let out a long, slow breath. The pool had once been a symbol of their love, quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. But now it was just water, a place of memories, both good and bad, a place where secrets had been hidden beneath the surface, only to be revealed when the time was right. And now Jake understood. There was no turning back. Not for him, not for Sarah. Jake couldn't shake the image of Sarah and Luke from his mind. The memory of their closeness, their shared laughter, and the way she had looked at him, with that glint of something more, something Jake hadn't seen in months, gnawed at him. He could still hear the echoes of her apology, the soft desperation in her voice. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. He stood by the pool, staring at his reflection in the water, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in hues of deep purple and orange, and the evening air was cool against the skin. It should have been calming, but all Jake could feel was a weight of betrayal pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had always thought he knew Sarah. He had believed in their love, their connection. But now, he didn't even know who she was anymore. The woman he thought he had married, the woman who had shared his dreams, his hopes, had vanished, replaced by someone capable of lying, of hiding a love affair in the shadows. Sarah's voice broke through the silence, calling out to him from the patio door. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely audible, but there was no mistaking the desperation behind it. "Please, we need to talk. We can work this out." Jake's jaw clenched at the sound of her voice. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear her excuses or her apologies. He had heard enough. Turning, he walked slowly back toward the door, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his decision. When he reached the threshold, Sarah was standing there, her face pale, her eyes pleading. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, as if the words themselves might bring some kind of resolution. "I never meant to hurt you, Jake. I swear, I was lost, and I didn't know what else to do." Jake's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he refused to let them fall. This wasn't about his pain anymore. This was about the truth, and it was too late for apologies. "You say you didn't mean to hurt me," he said, his voice tight. "But you did. You did it every day you kept this secret from me. You did it when you chose him over me." "I didn't choose him over you," Sarah protested, taking a step closer. "It wasn't like that. I was—" "No," Jake interrupted, shaking his head. "Stop. Just stop." He stepped back, pacing away from her, trying to keep his anger in check. But the more he thought about it, the more the rage built up inside him, like a storm waiting to break. He had been blind, so damn blind. She had chosen this. She had chosen him. And while Jake had been lost in his own excuses, believing in their perfect life, Sarah had been slowly pulling away. She had been slipping out of his grasp for months, and he hadn't even realized it. "You keep saying you didn't choose him," Jake said, turning back to her, his face flushed with anger. "But you did. Every time you lied to me. Every time you went out with him behind my back. You chose him when you kissed him by the pool. When you looked at him like that, like I was nothing." Sarah recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth, as if his words physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and Jake saw for the first time that she was truly broken. But it was too late. He couldn't bring himself to care about her tears now, not when she had shattered him so completely. "I've been fighting for this marriage, Sarah," Jake continued, his voice trembling now, a mixture of grief and fury. "I've been trying to make it work. But you—" He choked on the words, struggling to get them out. "You checked out. You gave up on me. You gave up on us." She collapsed onto the couch, her head buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Jake could see the guilt and the regret in the way she trembled, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The truth had been exposed, and the foundation of their marriage had crumbled beneath them. "I never wanted to hurt you," she sobbed. "I swear, Jake, I never wanted this. I was just so lonely. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to get you back." The admission hit Jake like a slap in the face. She had been lonely. He could see that now, feel the weight of it in the air between them. But he couldn't fix it. He couldn't undo the damage she had done. The trust had been shattered beyond repair, and every word she said now only dug the knife deeper into his heart. "I wasn't perfect either, Sarah," Jake said quietly, his voice breaking. "I've been distracted. I've been caught up in my own stuff. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped trying. You didn't even give me a chance." Sarah looked up, her eyes pleading, but Jake just shook his head. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when you've been lying to me, when you've been with someone else behind my back. She opened her mouth to speak again, but this time Jake didn't let her. I need to go, he said, his voice firm. I can't be here with you anymore. Not like this. Not after everything. The words stung more than he had expected. They burned like a fire searing through him. But there was no other way. No other choice. He couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies. He couldn't stay in a marriage that had been reduced to nothing but broken promises. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible. I never meant for it to end like this. Jake didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply turned and walked out the door, his heart heavy, but his mind made up. He had reached his breaking point. There was no going back. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, letting the silence settle around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a strange sense of relief. The storm inside him had passed, and while the future felt uncertain, one thing was clear. He couldn't let her keep hurting him. He had to let go, and that was exactly what he did. The days after Jake left the house were a blur. He didn't know where to go or what to do. His mind was still reeling from the discovery, from the conversation with Sarah, but the one thing he was sure was that he couldn't stay in that house, not with the memories of their marriage haunting every corner. The love they had once shared now felt like a distant ghost, something he couldn't reach no matter how hard he tried. He spent the first night at a friend's apartment, a small space that was too empty to feel like home, but still a welcome refuge. The quiet of the place gave him some peace, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. How was she handling all of this? Was she regretting what she'd done, or was she relieved? Finally free of the burden of living a lie? He tried not to care, but the question gnawed at him. Over the next few days, Jake kept his distance from Sarah. They didn't talk. Not once. The silence between them was deafening, a weight that pressed on his chest every time he thought of her. But he knew he couldn't go back. The trust had been broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. He began taking long walks through the city, trying to clear his mind. The rhythm of his steps was almost meditative, but nothing could truly quiet the storm inside him. Every time he passed by familiar places, memories of Sarah and their life together would resurface. They had walked down these same streets, sat at those same cafes. How had it all unraveled so quickly? The hardest part, though, was the guilt. It ate at him more than the anger or the pain. He felt guilty for not seeing the signs sooner. Guilty for not realizing how far apart they had grown. Had he been too focused on his work? Too absorbed in his own life? It seemed like he had missed so many little things that now stood out in stark contrast to the lies. But then again, guilt was something Sarah had to carry too. She had made her choices. And even if Jake had played a part in the distance between them, she had been the one to cross the line. She had chosen Luke. Still, the weight of it all didn't feel much better. The house felt cold, empty without Sarah's presence. Even the furniture seemed to carry the echoes of their past. The kitchen, once a place where they cooked together, now felt like a place of abandonment. The bedroom, where they had shared intimate conversations, now felt like a graveyard of memories. It wasn't just a loss of love that hurt. It was a loss of trust. The realization that everything he believed in, every promise they had made, had been nothing more than a facade. On the 5th day, Sarah called. Jake let the phone ring 3 times before picking it up. His pulse quickened, but he didn't want to appear weak. He wasn't going to be pulled back into the web of lies and apologies. Jake! Her voice was soft, almost tentative. Can we talk? He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to listen to the silence on the other end. What was there left to say? What could she possibly offer him now? I'm not asking you to forgive me, Sarah continued, her voice cracking. I need you to understand that this wasn't easy for me either. I didn't want to hurt you, but I didn't know how to fix things. I've made so many mistakes, and I know I can't take them back, but I'm sorry. Jake closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. It wasn't the apology that hurt him. It was a realization that her words were hollow, that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He was beyond the point of reconciliation. The love that had once been there was now a faint echo, a whisper that barely registered in his mind. I don't think we can fix this, Sarah, Jake said, his voice firm but weary. I'm sorry. I really am. But we're done. There was a long pause, and for a brief moment, Jake thought she might beg him to come back. But the silence stretched on, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was small, almost resigned. Okay, she said softly. I understand. And with that, they hung up. Jake sat in the silence of his apartment, the weight of the conversation settling over him. It was over. There were no more apologies to be given, no more explanations to be heard. All that remained was the wreckage of their marriage, the aftermath of broken promises and shattered trust. But in that moment, Jake felt a strange sense of clarity. The hardest part was over. The decision had been made. There would be no turning back. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. It was time to move on. It was time to rebuild. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Jake knew he was stronger now, stronger than the pain, stronger than the past. And as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Jake stood by the window, looking out over the city, ready to face whatever came next. Jake stood in the center of his life's wreckage, surrounded by the broken pieces of everything he had once believed in. The love, the trust, the dreams they had shared, gone, like sand slipping through his fingers. It had taken him days to process everything, to come to terms with the reality that the woman he had once known had chosen someone else. But now, as the weight of the past began to lift, something new emerged. Clarity. For so long, Jake had been defined by his marriage to Sarah. His sense of self had been intertwined with her, with the belief that their love was unbreakable. But now, standing alone, Jake was starting to understand that he was more than just a husband. He was an individual, someone who had the power to rebuild, to start over. The pain of betrayal would always be a part of him, but he didn't have to let it define his future. He didn't have to carry the weight of Sarah's choices or her lies with him forever. It wasn't easy to let go, but Jake knew that in order to heal, he had to free himself from the past. He had to forgive not only Sarah but himself, for missing the signs, for allowing the distance to grow so wide between them. Over the next few weeks, Jake started to rediscover parts of himself he had long neglected. He spent more time with friends, reignited old hobbies, and even began to focus on his work again. He traveled to new places, met new people, and in the quiet of those solitary moments, he began to reconnect with who he really was. The road ahead wasn't always smooth. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when memories of Sarah haunted his dreams. But with each passing day, the pain became more manageable, the emptiness less suffocating. Jake learned to embrace the discomfort, knowing it was a necessary part of moving forward. Ultimately, Jake understood that while the end of his marriage was painful, it was also the beginning of something new. It was a chapter he hadn't expected, but one that would shape him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. And though the future was uncertain, Jake was no longer afraid of it. He was ready to move forward, ready to rebuild, one step at a time. And in that, he found a kind of peace.